Welcome to Endemic, ladies and gentlemen. Winding down a pandemic, or trying. And in the infamous words of former President Bill Clinton, it might suffice to say that mistakes were made. My name is Major Mike Webb, former candidate for Arlington Public School Board, former Army top spy, and presently a candidate for U.S. Congress in Virginia's 8th Congressional District. And looking back on the current and continuously evolving public health crisis, at this snapshot in time, I believe that the best manner in which to view the government response to the current global public health crisis would be to recognize that even under the oft-cited precedent of the United States Supreme Court in Jacobson v. Massachusetts, public health policy in a pandemic is understood in courts as an exertion of the police powers, most often associated with law enforcement, aspects of which have been very topical in the press commentary and recent wave of litigations, and in recent years with situations involving the excessive use of force, such as those that spawned global protests on Black Lives That Matter, after some particularly provocative instances, or in the 8th Congressional District of Virginia 3 years before the pandemic and the tragic events that had occurred involving the Iranian accountant, Bijan Gazar, fatally shot 4 times in the head by apprehending officers after a police chase that lasted only about 4.5 minutes. And the pandemic emergency response finds many persons now on very different sides. I, interestingly, am on the same side, intellectually. According to the Progressive Voters Guide, I was opposed to the government response to the public health crisis, just as I was very publicly opposed during the shooting incident regarding Bijan Gazar. And this description on a partisan message platform may be a bit misleading because the basis for every litigation that I brought to court, totaling 7 thus far and going on 8, were brought in defense of religious liberties, guaranteed under the free exercise and establishment clauses in the First Amendment to the Constitution. And every single litigation was brought to correct those errors that had been made by government officials who had engaged in excessive force, in abuse of the police powers in the name of public health, a proposition rejected, however, by 80% of voters in a municipality with the highest number of government scientists, interestingly. And yet last December, even the Virginia governor had publicly conceded that with regard to restrictions imposed against places of worship, he had exceeded his constitutional authority. Although reluctant to make any further apologies, an argument that had been deemed sufficient to warrant an impeachment, however, against a former president, Donald Trump. And these double standards have been a persistent pattern arising in little concern or consternation, but stirring strong criticism throughout the current public health crisis for those who might be opposed to the government's excessive use of force in the exercise of police powers. On the anniversary of the pandemic declaration by the World Health Organization, President Joe Biden announced the American Rescue Plan, an aggressive vaccines campaign to place the nation on what he had described as a war footing. Very militaristic, full of bravado, in support of an exertion of the police powers of the state. Not to be confused, this is the police powers. Much like CDC Director Rochelle Walensky's announcement last summer upon the emergence and dominance of the Delta variant, concluding that the war had changed. But the president has never served in the military, and in fact exhausted a total of 5 exemptions from the draft to avoid the conflict in Southeast Asia, on a claim that he had medical conditions, not just religious, but medical conditions, not unlike many seeking exemption from the vaccines, but that had prevented him from serving in the military during a time of conflict. And today he is separating members of the military who have refused, without exemption, a mandate for compulsory vaccinations for what has been described as their refusal to obey a lawful order during a time when it is considered by the president to be a patriotic duty to be fully compliant, blindly following orders. This is the similar case that involved the boxer Cassius Clay, who decided that he did not want to serve the military during the conflict in Southeast Asia on his claims of having a religious exemption. Well, as a veteran and retired field-grade Army officer, I brought suit immediately after the celebration of Independence Day, which was supposed to be Freedom Day from the pandemic, when the vaccines were distributed to at least 70 to 80% of the American public to bring what was described as herd immunity. Actually, herd effect, the term accepted by science 2 decades ago. And I have challenged that contention regarding what constitutes a lawful order in court. Unlike any elected officials in the Commonwealth, a matter that has given rise to an interlocutory appeal, that's kind of a spin-off, in the form of an emergency application for injunction that has been presented to the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court regarding a simple non-response to a FOIA request. This action and another docketed for petition for certiorari on facial coverings mandates enabled us this week to petition to intervene in the litigation regarding the vaccines mandated by OSHA and the Department of Labor, where we will have the opportunity to join in the fight with several incumbent Republican governors across the nation. But by popular vote, I am not a Republican and will not be seeking the Republican nomination for Congress in Virginia's 8th Congressional District during the midterm elections in 2022. I did not stop becoming a Republican. The Republicans moved away from me. And that's just the way it is in life sometimes. I will be running as independent and will begin soliciting signatures to qualify for the November ballot in the new year. However, for the next few minutes, I wanted to take some time to discuss some aspects from one truly novel bit of litigation that illustrates these points regarding the use of excessive force that had sprung from the very first and longest surviving litigation challenge against the lockdown orders in the Commonwealth of Virginia, a matter also now on petition for certiorari at the United States Supreme Court, making a total of 4 potential opportunities for oral argument in the coming year. And at no point at the beginning of the pandemic did I think that these simple actions would have to go all the way to the Supreme Court. But I am pretty excited about that opportunity, especially having accomplished this without an attorney, a license to practice law, or even a law degree. And I believe that says a lot about what one person actually can do and accomplish, even in a global pandemic crisis. Times historically associated with confusion, fear, and despair, and illustrates the simple fact that crises present both danger and opportunity for those who are able to understand the risks and in battle fortune favorable. Excessive force cases often arise in litigation brought before the federal judiciary under what is often called Section 83 or 42 U.S.C. Sections 1983, which is the enabling statute, and Section 1988, which is the implementing provision, entitling a complainant to recover only reasonable attorney fees for rights that have been aggrieved by government action. You are not going to become a millionaire suing for redress of your constitutional rights, which is a sufficient business rationale for most law firms, especially powerful law firms, to simply not take your case, even on a pro bono basis. The publicity isn't even worth it. And these claims brought by litigants fighting for their civil rights quite often meet an affirmative defense from government officials with high-powered attorneys in Brooks Brothers suits that is described as sovereign immunity. Or in Sesame Street simplicity, you can't fight City Hall. You can't sue the government because they are the government doing their job. This arises from a presumption, just like your presumption of infection and danger, especially if unvaccinated, that government officials possess expertise, notwithstanding claims of good enough for government work, and need not be bothered with frivolous and vexatious suits when attempting to do their jobs for the general public. We've heard this quite often in the pandemic. And so let a hint to the wise be sufficient for those woke social justice warriors in a repeatedly quoted statement by government attorneys in the Commonwealth. The doctrine, to quote, the doctrine of sovereign immunity is alive and well in Virginia. Direct quote from the case Messina v. Burton, decided by the state Supreme Court, and reiterating that we make a distinction between the sovereign Commonwealth of Virginia and its employees, governmental agency created by the Commonwealth and its employees, quoting their 1979 decision, stare decisis, precedential value, in short, v. Griffiths. This is a drafting note for attorneys presenting complaints to court, or social justice ministers who want to talk about social justice and may not be familiar with the actual law. Not to be misunderstood, the government enjoys immunity, generally speaking, but as just like the vaccine manufacturers, except in the case of what is found to be willful misconduct, as stated in a much often cited case by departing State Attorney General Mark Herring, U.S. v. Chalk, a Fourth Circuit case that began in North Carolina, just south of us, and a case that arose during the civil unrest during the 1960s, which many people see as good guys, bad guys, to defend the governor's actions in the pandemic, was using the same case that the Governor Orville Falbus's and all those guys were using for your pandemic. All power, this is what the court recognized, even in the Fourth Circuit, all power may be abused if placed in unworthy hands. Quoting Luther v. Borden, a case from 1849, decided by the U.S. Supreme Court, the highest court, law of the land, during a very different time, particularly for persons of color. And in Chalk, the Fourth Circuit, while extending broad latitude to the government during rapidly developing crises, phrase often used by Mark Herring during the pandemic, yet stated that the courts cannot prevent abuse of power, but can sometimes correct it, most often at a later time, when cool heads and cool minds can look back with better objectivity, a sense of moral purpose, and a better understanding of the facts. This is exactly the circumstances that law enforcement encounter daily during arrest, where split-second decisions are required to protect both the public and the officer involved. And in pandemic, those supporting the government were essentially saying, go ahead and do what you need to the George Floyds and the Breonna Taylors because we have a pandemic crisis that is more important. So now, perhaps you can share some empathy with those who say blue lives matter and not take so much offense at that phrase. Having your feelings hurt. And it is of note that one of the most often quoted cases articulating a standard for defeating a claim of sovereign immunity uses the term shocks the conscience, described in Mohammed v. Holder, as in Eric Holder, a case decided by the Fourth Circuit in Richmond in 2017, the very year of the Bijan Gazar tragedy, explaining that the term moral turpitude refers to behavior that shocks the public conscience as being inherently base, vile, or depraved. And this is a very interesting description because it is very similar to the bright line rule that had been laid down during the trial of Adolf Eichmann for his crimes during the Holocaust, crimes against humanity. And after his evasion for 15 years, having escaped prosecution by fleeing to Argentina with many other Nazis, when the Attorney General for Israel had actually quoted from a German case that had been previously decided by Germans in German courts, not unfairly applying any rules not imposed by Eichmann's own government upon its own citizens, stating the distinguishing mark of a manifestly unlawful order should fly like a black flag above the given order, as a warning reading prohibited. Not mere formal illegality, hidden or half-hidden, not the kind of illegality discernible only to the eyes of legal experts, but a flagrant and manifest breach of law, certain and necessary illegality appearing on the face of the order itself, the clearly criminal character of the order or the acts ordered, and illegality clearly visible and repulsive to the heart, provided the eye is not blind, and the heart is not stony and corrupt. That is the extent of manifest illegality required to release a soldier from the duty of obedience upon him and make him criminally responsible for his acts. A case more familiar to many arose during the conflict in Southeast Asia, for which the president sought a personal exemption from his patriotic duty of military service, along with Congressman Donald Byer Jr., who has publicly stated that Jane Fonda, who had opposed the war and encouraged the efforts of the communist regime in Saigon, is one of his personal heroes. He in fact invited her to a event during his last election. The court-martial of Lieutenant William Calley, where the Court of Military Appeals has stated the acts of a subordinate done in compliance with an unlawful order given him by his superior are excused and impose no criminal liability upon him unless the superior's order is one which a man of ordinary sense and understanding would, under the circumstances, know to be unlawful, or if the order in question is actually known to the accused to be unlawful. And this may be an evolving standard. You shoot one person and you sit there and say that looked okay. You shoot two people, you say that looked okay. Suddenly you have 10,000 dead bodies and you're not asking questions. There's something wrong. Something terribly wrong. In criminal law, we often speak of two components to a crime: an actus reus, or the actual act or conduct, as well as the mens rea, or culpable state of mind, which may evolve over time. Both are required, and this is why there generally is a legal distinction between premeditated murder and involuntary, as well as voluntary manslaughter. Although in the Commonwealth, you will not find the word manslaughter even mentioned in the criminal code, because any murder other than capital murder is described as murder in the third degree in the Commonwealth. Virginia is described as a slayer law jurisdiction for your greater edification. You can look up what that means. So let's delve deeper into this mental element. Put our thinking caps on for charging a criminal offense. In the Commonwealth, means of knowledge with a duty of using them are in equity equivalent to knowledge itself. And this is a quote from the U.S. Supreme Court case in Cordova v. Hood, decided in 1873. If you have the opportunity to know, but neglected in due diligence to know pertinent facts, it's not an excuse. Ignorance of the law is not an excuse. Can't go to the judge and say, but I didn't know, Your Honor. You have a duty to know. Moreover, participation in the formation of a conspiracy is not essential to culpability if after it was formed, the defendant aided or abetted with an understanding of its purpose. As a quote from Lutheran v. U.S., decided by the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals in 1937. And at least in the 8th Circuit, as stated in Gwynn v. U.S., there must, in addition to such knowledge or approval, be voluntary, willing, knowing, and intentional cooperation or agreement to cooperate before there can be any conspiracy. So, just knowing that a conspiracy exists is generally not a crime. But if you have actionable knowledge and perform actions in furtherance thereof, and we can demonstrate that you have knowledge, you may be held criminally liable. And you can take for a historic example the hanging of Mary Surratt, the owner of the boarding house that had been used by John Wilkes Booth and others in the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, the very first woman to be hung in the United States back in 1865. And now let's just give a little caveat in terms of certain conspiracies. It has been determined that under 18 U.S.C. 2332B or Bravo, That would be conspiracy to commit transnational terror. Just the fact that you were involved in transnational terror means we need prove nothing more. That needs to be understood. Also, under USB Elliott, we know that if a conspiracy is established by the government, then once it's established, only slight evidence is required to charge others with participation in the conspiracy as co-conspirators. So the standard comes down once that conspiracy has been established. So let's say that you are Mary Surratt of pandemic. You just happen to know the wrong folks at the wrong time. We're going to try to help you out. From a legal perspective, at least, the courts have said that in order to show withdrawal, the defendant must show that he has committed affirmative acts inconsistent with the object of the conspiracy that are communicated, not just done the acts, but communicated in a manner reasonably calculated to reach conspirators. Okay, and this is a very recent reiteration of the law by the Fifth Circuit in 2013. A bribery case brought against a government employee, U.S. v. Heard, and this is a very, very simple bribery case. Guy was a government employee. Guy who was a contractor decided he was going to give him a golf tournament gift. And the government employee tried to say that it was just a gift that did not influence his decisions at all, but the court disagreed. U.S. v. Heard was quoting their prior decision in the 1998 case of U.S. v. Mann and the 1994 case of U.S. v. Puig Infante. So this is established precedent and settled law. It'll be very, very hard to find some wiggle room on that. And for those like Peter during the cocking of the crows trial in the Synoptic Gospel of Matthew, hoping to get away with the right to remain silent on his first denial of Christ, that court stated that the rule was that mere cessation of activity and furtherance of the conspiracy is not sufficient to show withdrawal. I'm just not going to do that anymore. Doesn't work. A quote from the 1997 Fifth Circuit case of U.S. v. Torres, inciting to their 1981 decision in U.S. v. Phillips. Again, established law. For review, you have a right to remain silent. But if you are implicated in a conspiracy, you have a duty to perform affirmative acts to get yourself the hell out of that conspiracy. Not just efficacious, like our vaccines, but effective actions to provide you immunity against criminal liability. Not just an extra layer of protection. Are we clear? In the next installment of this series, we're going to get into the curious case of a sheriff who found Jesus during a pandemic and decided against the governor's repeated warning to join a place of worship, which the governor has repeatedly described as hotbeds of infection. Even last December, when he had conceded that he had gone too far in his restrictions against places of worship. A sheriff who, evidently approaching retirement, decided that he had done something that needed the help of the Lord so much that he was willing to risk infection from a highly contagious lethal disease, very, very transmissible of report. At least that is what they're saying in the press. But for now, as we close out, let's just quote one line from Manders v. Lee, an 11th Circuit case decided in 2003, and which lays out the Manders factors for excessive force doctrine. If a sheriff's policy permits excessive force in the county jail, plainly the governor may discipline the sheriff. The governor may. If a sheriff fails to take custody of state offenders in the county jail, plainly the governor may discipline the sheriff. The state legislature has made Sheriff Peterson answerable to the governor for his conduct and policy. And so we can assume that in that case, just from those statements, that things did not go well for the Sheriff Peterson in that case. And mindful of the necessary element of actionable knowledge for implication in the charge of conspiracy, let me simply close with the damning lines from the presiding court in the Eichmann trial. Undoubtedly, he knew the tale about administration of tonics to which he put his signature. This briefing is unclassified. Until next time, you have a right to remain silent. As you were. My name is Major Mike Webb, and by God, I am running for U.S. Congress. Next year, let's make the right choice, and we shall make America great again. Honest. And y'all come back now. Here, carry on.
This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb.
Thunk, I could have had a vaccine.